Eruvin, Daf Samaches through Ayin Daled. On Daf Samaches, the Gemara continues the story of the child whose hot water had spilled out, and they couldn't carry the water because there was no Eruv. So, Amrle Rabba bar Rav Chanan Abaye, the Gemara says he raised an objection. He was surprised. He told Abaye, Mavoa deispe trei gavri ravri krabanan. There were two great chachamim in this mavoi, in this alley, loli havi lo eruv lo shituf. About they had explained that there was no eruv chatzeros and no shitufim mavos in this area. How can it be? How can you have a mavoi with great chachamim without an eruv and a shituf? The Rishonim, later the Achronim, infer from this Gemara that chachamim, leaders who are responsible, who would do the right thing, should establish an eruv anywhere they are. Ritva says, Lo mi boile l'tzurva midrabanan. A tzurv merabanan and Talmud Chacham should not live in a place that doesn't have an eruv. In the Tshuvas Gaoni Mizrach Umarav, he was matmiya, the person who was asked the question, the Gaon who was asked the question, maybe Rav Natranai Gaon, was matmiya. He said, you don't have an eruv. Chachamim gedolim shekamoschem, great chachamim like you, balei Torah, medaktikim dvar halacha. How come you don't have an eruv? Our Gemara says that when we have chachamim, we expect them to do an eruv. Mordechai says, Mordechai gives us the reason. Why do we assume that chachamim would always make an eruv? He brings our Gemara and he says, you see, it's a mitzvah to make an eruv. Time Rabbah, there's a great reason why you have to have an eruv. Because otherwise people will do isurim. People will violate Shabbos by carrying from houses to the chatzeros. So they have to have an eruv to stop people from violating the laws of Shabbos. The Chasim Sofer in a tshuva says that it's the responsibility of the Rav, the Talmud Chacham in the city, that he should take care of arranging an eruv. If not, then the stumbling block, the michshol of people violating Shabbos will be his fault, because he should be making an eruv, as per our Gemara. Abaye had to explain why he couldn't make an eruv, as the Gemara goes on. So these poskim understand that the reason why we expect chachamim to make an eruv is to avoid people transgressing the Isser of Shabbos. The Gemara was talking about eruv chatzeros. The Nesiva Shabbos explains that it applies equally to what we call the eruv, the strings, the tzuras of Pesach, the fences, because you can't carry without that either. So if the need is to have an eruv so nobody will transgress the laws of Shabbos, that also means that you have to make the tzuras of Pesach. Ramosha Feinstein, in his debates with other poskim about the Eruvin in New York, Ramosha Feinstein downplayed the need to make Eruvin. He acknowledges that it's a good idea. Elsewhere, he did encourage Eruvin apparently, but when he explained why he didn't think there was such a great need to make an Eruvin in New York, his primary objections were he didn't think it was halachically valid. But when he also explained why it's not such a mitzvah, he said it's not such a big deal. If people are going to be Rishayim and carry without an Eruv, it's not our responsibility. What does our Gemara mean? Our Gemara says there is a mitzvah to make an Eruv. The Gemara doesn't say why, but it says it's a mitzvah that they should be making an Eruv. We expect the Chachamim to make an Eruv. Why? So Ramosha says that was true in earlier generations, in different societies, where an Eruv was imperative. People didn't have what they needed at home. Ramosha explains why to take care of their animals they needed an Eruv. Even for people, he said, people didn't have enough water, they didn't have other things they needed. People needed to carry. They had to have an eruv, he says. Here, we have no such need. People prepare for a week at a time. We have refrigerators, he says. We have mekararim, and so on. He says, today an eruv is not so essential. Makes things easier. Sure, makes it easier if you have an eruv, he says. But the concern of the Gemara that we have to have an eruv doesn't really apply today. Other Rabbanim disagreed. Other Rabbanim said to have a family cooped up in a small apartment, that is a great need. It applies today as well. Either way, it's interesting. Ramosha seems to have understood that the primary imperative of making an eruv indicated in our Gemara is to make things easier. We saw the Mordechai, the Chasim Sofer say it's to avoid michshol, to avoid people carrying. Ramosha says it's because you need to carry. Maybe Ramosha meant because you need to carry, people will do it and will be over. Ramosha stresses how badly you need an eruv. Ramosha agrees, we can still stop people, it'll still help, an eruv is a good idea, all else being equal, it'll help to stop people who are otherwise not keeping Shabbos from doing Averis, he says, but that's not really our responsibility. Meikra din, it's not a chiyuv, he says, if people are Rishayim and don't follow the laws of Shabbos, it's not strictly speaking our responsibility, and therefore it's not really a chiyuv, and the concern of our Gemara doesn't really apply, Ramosha felt, in contemporary times. In the book, The Laws of an Eruv, the authors write that many Rabbanim in America were opposed to the establishment of citywide Eruvin. Rav Aaron was opposed, they say, because he felt that we should be concerned for the opinion that even a city that does not have 600,000 people, as long as it has streets that are 16 amos wide, that's a Rishus Rabbim Daraisa, and our type of Eruv, as we explained in earlier Shiurim, won't be valid. They bring Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky for other reasons. He's also apparently opposed to Eruvin. But in principle, there's a long string of Rishonim and Achronim based on our Gemara and other sources that say there's a mitzvah to make an Eruv either to stop people from violating Shabbos or to make things easier for people on Shabbos. On Dafim Samach and Samach Tes, the Gemara talks about the Tzeduki that we had back in the Mishnah. The Gemara brings the Machlokes, Tzeduki Hareu Kenachri. One Tana says Tzeduki is like a Nachri, he has the status of a non-Jew for purposes of Eruvin. Rabbi Gamliel says Tzeduki Einam Kenachri. Tzeduki is not like a Nachri. Tzeduki, even though he rejects much of Torah and much of halachic observance and much of the Torah, he's not considered a Nachri. The halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel that Tzeduki is not like a Nachri. Shulchan Aruch Paskin Tzeduki Areu Ki Yisrael, and he can be Mevatel Rishus. However, there is a complication. Does this Tzeduki actually observe Shabbos in public before Hesio or not? The Gemara goes on in Samach Tes, distinguish between someone who violates Shabbos and for Hesio or not. Tosa says that if a mumar who's machal Shabbos before Hesio, he publicly violates Shabbos, is considered like a non-Jew for purposes of Eruvin, for other purposes of Eruvin, then how can a Tzeduki be like how can a Tzeduki not be like a Nachri? We pass when Tzeduki is not like a Nachri or Gamliel Shita, but he's machal Shabbos. And even L'chari even for Hesio. Tosa discusses whether Chil Shabbos on Issa Drabanan is enough for that or not. Rashi seems to learn even Drabanan on our sugya, but the question is, if the Tzeduki violates Shabbos, how can he not be like a Nachri? So Tosfos says the Tzedukim, even though they rejected the halacha as we practice it, still before Hestia they were afraid enough, they had enough respect and reverence for the Chachamim, that they fear of the Chachamim, he says, that they wouldn't be Machal Shabbos before Hestia. So that's Tosfos Shita, that in principle, someone who's Machal Shabbos before Hestia, like a Tzeduki, would be like a Nachri. The reason the Tzedukim in the Gemara were not like a Nachri is because they were not Machal Shabbos before Hestia. Other Rishonim, the Rambam possibly, seem to hold that the Tzeduki is actually like a Tinok Shenishpa. We had earlier that in Shabbos, the idea of Tinok Shenishpa, it's not his fault, he was captured and raised by the non-Jews. He doesn't know about the Torah and mitzvahs, even though the Tzedukim are not actually captured by the non-Jews. The Rambam says that the Tzedukim of our time, he explains, the real Apikursim, real Kofrim B'Torah are considered like Goyim in many ways, but he says those in our time, B'nei Hatoim, B'nei B'neim, the grandchildren, that they're already born into a misguided faith, they're like Tinok Shenishpa, even though they don't adopt mitzvahs, they're like Anus, it's not their fault, even though we've told them that they should, we've explained to them that they're wrong and that the truth is, this is the right way to keep Torah, they're Anus because they were raised on their toes. Rambam seems to say that the Tzedukim in his time, the Karaites, were not considered like Nachrim, were not considered like Machal Shabbos. And that would be even if they were Machal Shabbos, because they're like Tinok Shenishpa. So the Rambam is understood by the Beis Yosef, and some poskim is that the Tzedukim of the Rambam's time, maybe of later times, are not considered like Nachrim, they're considered like Tinok Shenishpa. There is a great debate in the Rambam, the Radvaz, in the 16th century, there was a great debate. The Radvaz says, even according to the Rambam, that means when you start with the Tzeduki, before you have a chance to explain it to him, explain the truth to him, he's considered a Tinok Shenishpa because that's how he was raised. But once you've spoken to him and you've reprimanded him and you've remonstrated with him and he optionally refuses to listen to the truth, then he's considered like someone who completely rejects the Torah and a Rasha and a Machal Shabbos, and then he would have the status of a non-Jew for many purposes. Other poskim say no, that he remains an honest, that even after you try to remonstrate with him, he's not going to listen to you because he wasn't raised like that. So the status of Tzedukim after they've been exposed to the Torah, after we've talked to them and tried to makarev them, is a great machlokes achronim in many areas of halacha, many ramifications for the status of modern non-observant Jews in halacha. For our purposes of Eruv, we have a machlokes poskim. Beis Yosef understands the Rambam to be saying that Tzedukim would be Tinok Shenishpa, that even if they are Machal Shabbos before Hestia, not like Tosfos. Tosfos says that Tzedukim are only like Yisrael if they're not Machal Shabbos before Hestia. But the Beis Yosef understands the Rambam to hold, even if they are Machal Shabbos before Hestia, it doesn't matter because they're Tinok Shenishpa, they're still Einam Kenachri, like Rabbi Gamliel. Other Rishonim, Tos and the Rosh, say no, Tzedukim are only not Kenachri if they're not Machal Shabbos before Hestia. The Shulchan Aruch just says, Tzeduki Areu Ki Yisrael. Mishnah Berurah brings the Machlokes, that some poskim say, even if they are Machal Shabbos before Hestia, other poskim say, only if they're not Machal Shabbos before Hestia. The Mishnah Berurah says, the ramification is for the non-Jews in our time. The non-Jews in our time certainly are Machal Shabbos before Hestia. Those who are not observant have no fear of the Chachamim. They're Machal Shabbos before Hestia. According to the Rambam, we can treat them like Tinok Shenishpa. According to the other poskim, no, once they're Machal Shabbos before Hesya, at least for the purpose of Eruvin, they do not have the status of Yisrael any longer. The Shartiyan strongly inclines toward the stringent view that they are not considered like Yisrael, and he says, even if we're going to say, first of all, he says the Rambam seems pretty clear, not like the Beis Yosef, the Rambam seems pretty clear that they are considered like Nachrim if they're Machal Shabbos before Hesya. Moreover, he says, the Svar is like that. Even if we say in other areas of Halacha, the concept of Tinuk Shenishba applies to modern non-observant Jews, he says, but here we should definitely treat them like non-Jews, because the whole takana that a non-Jew, you need Skiris Rishus, is Kadesh Yilmad Mimasav, as we had previously. Chazal were concerned that if Jews got too cozy with non-Jews, they would learn their bad habits. So a non-observant Jew today who behaves like a Gentile, he says, it doesn't matter whether it's his fault or not, whether he was raised like that, he doesn't know the truth, it's a pity on him, maybe God won't punish him, he says, but at the end of the day, if he behaves like a non-Jew, the same concern of Shul Yilmad Mimasav still applies. So even if it's Tino Shenishba, the Mishnah Berurah strongly inclines toward the view that we should treat the modern non-observant Jew for purpose of Eruv as a non-Jew, not as a Jew. Another question that Achronim raised, Tosfos Shabbos says that, okay, Tosfos says he's not a Tino Shenishba, we're talking about a Tzeduki who's not Machal Shabbos in public. But says the Tosfos Shabbos, but he's not Bikaris, he rejects the words of the Chachamim. The poskim say someone who's not mamin with divrei Chazal, he doesn't believe the words of the Masorah, the words of our tradition, that itself is dino ka'akum. Our Gemara discusses various criteria for being considered a mumar, chil Shabbos, avodah zara, mumar l'chol terakula. But the poskim say someone who rejects divrei Chachamim, who doesn't accept the authenticity of Torah, that itself is grounds to be a mumar, to be like an akum. So the Tzedukim, even if they're not technically Machal Shabbos before Hesya, as maybe they weren't back then in the time of the Talmud, but there are Bikurim who reject the veracity of the Torah. So why doesn't that make them into mumrim, into dinam kenachrim? So some Achronim say in the Chidush Gershuni, based on a tshuva of the Maria Sad, he says even someone who doesn't believe in divrei Chachamim is only considered an apikaris and like a guy only if he brazenly, obstinately does that. However, if he makes an honest mistake and he just errs and he thinks the Chachamim are wrong, even if he's wrong and about such a major thing, he's not considered a guy. When we say he's like a guy, we mean someone who is malagleg, who knows better, and nevertheless max chazal, zadon, b'mezid, just max chazal. That's the person dino ka'akum. But someone who just makes a mistake and doesn't realize that chazal are right, such a person is not considered dino ka'akum. Such a person is not dino ka'akum, and therefore the tzedukim, who would be considered enum kenachri, even if they reject the Torah, as long as they're not machal shabbos before Hesya, or as long as they're tino shenishba with regard to that, the fact that they reject the truth of the Torah doesn't give them the din of a non-Jew. On Daf Ayin, the Gemara talks about various cases where people in the Chatzar died. The question is, does their Eruv persist? They made an Eruv, but then the person in the Chatzar died, and his heir, the person who takes possession of the Chatzar, is not from the Chatzar. The Gemara has various permutations. The Shulchan Aruch has various permutations. The basic rules are that if the person made an Eruv and he died after Shabbos, doesn't matter what happens. Once his Eruv was valid at the beginning of Shabbos, then his Chatzar, his property, is okay, even though he died on Shabbos. If he died before Shabbos, the halacha is then if he died before Shabbos, then there's no Eruv because the new person didn't make an Eruv. Then it depends if the new person moves in by Shabbos or is an absentee owner on Shabbos. Those are the basic rules that govern this case. But in general, if someone made an Eruv and then dies on Shabbos, everything is okay. If he died before Shabbos, then we have a problem. Shulchan Aruch says if he's meis b'Shabbos and he's Erev, doesn't matter who's Yarish, Eina Oser. In low Erev, then you have a problem. If he didn't make an Erev, he says, then you would have a problem. And if you low Erev, then you have a problem. Halacha l'maisa, these halachas are not that relevant because halacha l'maisa, we make an Erev at the beginning of the year. We make an Erev typically once a year around, from Pesach to Pesach commonly. So those halachas are actually discussed, that we make an Eruv once a year. What happens if new people move in? Somebody dies, somebody sells his house, a new house is built, you have new people who move in. How does our Eruv work for them? So the halacha is that when we make an Eruv, it says that if you make an Eruv once a year, you have to make sure that the Eruv, that we typically do an Eruv al yidei zikui, we give a portion of our box of matzah, our box of bread, to everyone who lives in the community, everyone who lives in the city. So the Shulchan Aruch says that you have to mizakeh to everyone who currently lives there and to anyone else who comes in throughout the year, throughout the term of the Erev. You're giving them a share now to anyone who may wind up moving in. Yesh Amrim, some say, even if you don't explicitly say I'm giving a share in the Erev to everyone who moves in, it's automatic. Mishnah Berurah explains it's automatic. Not that it's inherently automatic. If you don't say it's the future residence, it's not the future residence. Automatic means, since our minhag is that we make an Erev once a year, and it's clear that we want the Erev to work on autopilot, to be automatically valid for the whole year, so it's clear that we want the Erev to work for everyone who moves in during the year. So all these halachas in the Gemara of people dying, and people inheriting, and people moving in, is all when they used to make Eruvin one Shabbos at a time for specific people. The Erev we make today, which is one Erev for an entire community for a whole year, automatically includes anyone who moves in, anyone who has a house in the community throughout the term of the Erev. Our Erev covers all of that. On Daf Ayin Aleph, Ayin Beis, the Gemara brings a machlokas, whether we say Somchen al Shituf Makom Erev. We know that there are two mechanisms Chazal defined. One is Eruvin Chatzeros, where all the different houses in the Chatzer join and put an Eruvin Chatzeros for the Chatzer. The other is Shtufei Mavos, where all the different Chatzeros put some food together to combine all their different Chatzeros in the same mother. So ordinarily you would make two, one Shituf and one Erev. The different members of the Chatzer put food together and make an Eruvin Chatzeros. Different members of the Mavoi put food together and make Shtufei Mavos. The Gemara discusses, can you have one Erev, one thing for both of them? So the Gemara says that there's a machlokus whether you say Somchen al Shituf Makom Erev, can you rely on a Shituf instead of an Erev? Machlokus, Mar Sever Ein Somchen, Mar Semer Somchen. The Gemara brings a brisa. The brisa says, Ma'arvin b'chatzeres u'mishtafin b'mavoi, that you should make both Erev and Shituf. Why? If you just make a shituf, the children won't realize that the shituf is being the Erev, so they'll say, we're not doing an Erev, and it's fine. That's for Meir Shita, that you should do both, because of this concern of Tinokos, you have to have a shituf and an Erev. So I'm saying, one or the other. We paskin like Rabbi Meir. However, the Gemara brings a machlokas, Rabbi Nechumi and Rabba, Chadam are b'pas, Kuli amalo pligi d'b'chadasagi. That one says that if you make an Erev with bread, a shituf with bread, everyone agrees that you can use bread for both. If you make it with yayin, with the food other than bread, that's the machlokas. Chadam are b'yayin kol pligi d'b'inan tarti. The other one said everyone agrees bread is better than wine. The other shita says no. If you make it with wine, everyone agrees that can't cover both. Machlokas is whether you make it with bread. We paskin, on the one hand, we paskin like Rabbi Meir, that you have to have both, but we paskin that's only if you don't do it with bread. The Shulchan Aruch says you have to have shituf and erev because of the tinokos, because of the children. However, if you do it with bread, we paskin, then it's fine, then you can have only one. However, the Shulchan Aruch brings a machlokas, when you have one, some say that means you can have one shituf, which works as an erev, only, he says, if each chatzar has its own Erev within it, then you have then you have a Shtufei Mavos where the Chatzeros join in the Mavi with the Shituf. Then you samech on the Shituf to join the Chatzeros, even though they made their individual Erev Chatzeros, to carry from one Chatzer to the other through doors between them. But without an Erev in the Chatzer at all, with none of the Chatzeros did anything, all they did was one communal Shituf in the Mavi. Some say that even if you did it with bread, the Shulchan Aruch says it's not good enough, and you have to have one Erev and one Shituf. So halacha l'maaseh, the way we do things with one Shituf, with one process in a shul, with one thing in the community, there's machlok. We do it with bread, with matzah, but there's machlokes whether the halacha l'maaseh that is good or not. The Shulchan Aruch brings two opinions. Even if you're using bread, but if you do nothing in the individual chatzeros, some say then we still samech on Shituf makam Erev, and some say we are not. The Ramah comes along and says, Yesh Amrim, it doesn't matter what they do in the Chatzeres, Yesh Amrim, that it's always okay, as long, one Shituf can always, if you make it with bread, can always fulfill the role of the Erev. The Ramah says, our minhag is to do it with bread, but we only make one. We don't make two separate ones. Why? So the Ramah says that what we do is different from the time of Chazal. In the time of Chazal, he says that in the time of Chazal, each Chatzer only gave one piece of bread toward the Shituf, but individual members of the Chatzer didn't give anything toward the Shituf. But today, where each members of the Chatzer gives toward the Shituf, that L'Kuli Alma can serve as one big Eruvin Chatzeros and Shtufei Mavos. Other posts can disagree and say that no, it really doesn't work, but the reason that we do it with one is because we're somech on the first shita and the mechaber, the Ramah shita before, the second shita that says that no matter what you do, it's enough to have, even if the Chatzeros don't do anything, it's enough to have one shita which can serve as both Eruv and shita. So our minhag is not really so clear. It's not really so clear what we rely on, whether it's machlokes, these two opinions in the mechaber and the Ramah, whether we're somech on the svar that today is different because everyone contributes toward the shita. Mishnah Berurah recommends Yoser Tov that it's better to be explicit when you make your shtufim avos, when you make your eruv, you should say explicitly that I'm doing it both as a shituf and an eruv. Then L'Kuli Alma, he says, the Ritva says, L'Kuli Alma, if you're explicit that you want it to be both, then everyone agrees it can be both. So that's what you should do ideally. The minhag is we only do one, but L'Chatchila, the Mishnah Berurah says, you should explicitly declare that you want it to function both as an eruv and as a shituf. On Ayin Beis and Ayin Gimel, the Gemara has a discussion about several brothers who are eating, they eat together at their father's table, but they have their own houses where they sleep, so they sleep in separate houses, but they eat together. So the Gemara says they need an Eruv, they need a separate Eruv. So the Gemara says, why do you need a separate Eruv? Is that because Makom Lina Gorim? Is that because they sleep separately and Eruv depends on where you sleep, and if you sleep in separate houses, you're like separate households and separate families and you need an Eruv? The Gemara says, no, Mekable Prashanu. This is a different case. This is not a case where they actually eat together. This is a case called Mekable Pras. But in general, we would say Makom Achilas Garim. The Gemara brings machlokes about this. Makom Dira, Rav Amar, Makom Pita, Shmuel Amar Makom Lina. It's actually a machlokes Rav and Shmuel, whether Eruv depends on where they eat or where they sleep. We paskin Makom Pita Garim. We paskin Eruv depends on where they eat. So therefore, we paskin as follows in these halachos. We paskin that if you have multiple members of the Chatzer, different households, but they all eat together, even though they all have separate houses for sleeping, they don't need an Eruv, because since they eat together, they all eat together, and they all have their meals together, communal dining, therefore they're considered one household, because we say Makom Pita Garim. The Ramah adds, if multiple families eat in one room, on their own tables, Mishnah Berurah explains that the Ramah is adding, Mechaber is talking about a case they all eat on one table. Even if they eat on separate tables, but if they all eat in one house, in one room, in one house, that's still enough. We say Makom Pita Garim, they're considered one family, one household unit, they don't need an Eruv. And that's the Shulchan Aruch passings in the next sip, that if you sleep in one place and eat in another place, Makom Achila Iker, we pass in Makom Pita, Makom Achila is the Iker, and everything depends, L'Kula L'Chumra, everything depends on where they eat. If they eat together, even if they sleep separately, that the requirement of Eruvin Chatzeros is not triggered. The Batel HaChachma has a question. He was asked about a group of families. They had separate houses. In a Chatzer, they slept separately. They ate separately during the week. But on Shabbos, they took the meals together at the house of a patriarch of the family, the father-in-law of one of the members, at least, of one of the families. So they all ate together. They ate the Friday night Suda, the Shabbos Suda together. Shal Shudas, they went to shul, but they ate the meals together, either at this one family's house or in the shul. But during the week, they ate separately. It was only Shabbos they used to spend their Shabbos meals together. So he discusses whether we paskin Makom Achila is the determining factor. So if it's only on Shabbos but not during the week, so how do we look at that? So he says it doesn't matter. We look at what they do on Shabbos. If on Shabbos they eat together, and Eruvin Chatzeros is not required. Furthermore, he says even if they normally eat separately at their own house, they normally eat in one place, but on this particular Shabbos, they're eating someplace else, or vice versa. They normally don't eat where they sleep, and today they are eating where they sleep. If they shift where they eat on one particular Shabbos, you follow that particular Shabbos, he says, not where they normally eat, but where they're eating this particular Shabbos. So what they do during the week doesn't matter. What they do on other Shabbos doesn't matter. What matters is what they are doing this Shabbos in question. Then in the next Shuvah, he discusses what if they split the Shabbos meals? What if they eat Friday night in one place, Shabbos day in a different place? He says either one of those two places is called Makom Achila, and either one can cause a problem. If they all eat together Friday night, but they eat in separate places Shabbos day, they need an Eruv, or vice versa. If they all eat together Friday night, if they all eat separate places Friday night, even if they all eat together Shabbos day, in either of those cases, if any one of the major meals of Shabbos they eat separately, then an Eruv is triggered. However, he says if they eat all the meals together, just to eat some snacks, they have mazonos, even bread, they have a minor meal, just a small meal of bread, that doesn't matter. What we look at is the major meals, the significant meals. That's what establishes whether they need an Eruv or not. On Daf Ayin Gimel and Ayin Daled, the Mishnah talks about Chamesh Chatzeros Psucha Zu Lazu Psuchas L'Mavoi. There are 5 Chatzeros, 5 yards, 5 courtyards, all of them open into each other as well as into the Mavoi. The Mishnah goes on, the Mishnah talks about making a Shituf, making an Eruv, again, complicated rules. Rav says we have to change the Gerus in the Mishnah. We cannot have the Gerus in the Mishnah as written that they are Psucha Zu Lazu, that the Chatzeros open to each other, because Rav says, the Gemara explains, Rav held that if they would open to each other, they would all be considered one Chatzer. And then he says we wouldn't do Shtufim Avos, because more than that, you wouldn't have the Eitz of Lechi B'Kara. The halacha is, going back to what we learned a while ago in Eruvin, at the very beginning of Eruvin, the first parak of Eruvin talks about Lechi and Kara. Lechi and Kara were the vertical pole, the horizontal pole, that can serve as a tikkun of a mavoi, but in lieu of a full tzuras of Pesach, which is what we do. But these tikkunim of Lechi and Kara that the Gemara was so busy with in the beginning, they only work if you have a proper mavoi, a properly constituted mavoi. A mavoi needs chatzeros ubatim psuchas l'tocho. It needs yards opening onto the mavoi, and each yard has to have multiple batim. So Rav held that in the Mishnah's case, if the chatzeros open onto each other directly, normally the chatzeros open to the mavoi, and you want to go out into the mavoi, then you go to the other chatzer. But if the chatzeros open straight to each other also, besides opening to the mavoi, then the chatzeros are considered one, and we no longer have multiple chatzeros opening to the mavoi, because all the individual chatzeros are called one, and then the mavoi would lose the status of a mavoi. We would no longer be able to use a lechi and kara. That's the shita of Rav. Ein mavoi nitzer b'lechi b'kara ad sheyu batim v'chatzeros psuchim l'tocha. We do paskin Rav's basic rule that a mavoi doesn't have the status of a mavoi with its attendant leniencies, certainly with its attendant leniencies, unless we have these conditions of batim v'chatzeros psuchim l'tocha. There's machlokes rishonim whether we paskin like Rav's extension of that if the chatzeros open to each other, they lose their status as multiple chatzeros, and the mavoi then loses its status as a mavoi. The second din, again, the basic din is brought in Shulchan Aruch, that ein mavoi niter b'lechi o kara, unless you have psuchim l'tocho shnei chatzeros, or l'chol chatzer shnei batim at least. But regarding whether those chatzeros can open into each other, so the first opinion is, the Rosh and the Mordechai, we don't paskin like Rav, that even if the chatzeros are psucha zu lazu, it's still considered a proper mavoi. The Yesh Omrim, the Shita, the Rif, and the Rambam, Yesh Chalkim, and say that if the chatzeros open onto each other, they're all considered one large chatzer, and then the mavoi is considered a degenerate mavoi and doesn't have the tikkun of lechi b'kara. Mishnah Berurah brings, the Achronim say it's a milsa drabanan. This whole question of lechi b'kara is drabanan. So we go l'kula, that even if the chatzeros open onto each other, it would still be considered a proper mavoi. But as we noted in Shiurim in the beginning of Eruvin, this rule that a mavoi only has a special dinam of lechi b'kara if it's properly constructed, according to the format of Chazal, with 2 chatzeros and each one has at least 2 batim. This is the reason why the Ramah brings that we don't do lechi b'kara at all. We don't do these things at all because the Ramah says that our mavos, that Noagin Ha'idna, today the custom is we do only Tzuras of Pesach. Why? Because our mavos have a din of chatzeros. Our mavos, we don't give the kulos of mavoi, and the reason is because we don't have the proper structure of Chazal. We don't have chatzeros opening to the mavoi and batim opening to the chatzeros. We don't build that way, so therefore we don't have the status of a mavoi, and therefore we don't rely on the leniencies of lechi and kara. There is a machlokas whether when the Ramah says we don't have these types of mavois, does he simply mean we don't have that physical layout? Our houses open straight to the mavos. We don't have this layout of chatzer. The Chayadim understood like that. The Chayadim says that in Vilna, they actually built their city with batim and chatzeros psuchas l'mavoi. They actually were constructed like in the time of Chazal. So in Vilna, he says they would have a din mavoi, and you would have the kula of lechi b'kara. However, the Chazon Ish disagrees. The Chazon Ish says that it doesn't matter whether physically we have the layout of the time of Chazal or not. Even if you have a city like Vilna that had chatzeros opening to mavoi and batim opening to chatzeros, he says it doesn't matter because the way we use our property, the way we use our chatzeros, isn't like the way they used it in the time of Chazal. In the time of Chazal, the chatzer was considered an extension of the house. They used to cook there and bake there and do laundry there, he says. Today, we don't use chatzeros like that, he says. So even if in terms of the actual structures, it looked like it did in the time of Chazal. Since the way the property is used is different from the way it looked in the time of Chazal, it doesn't matter. So today's mavoi would not have the din of the mavoi because it isn't accompanied by chatzeros that function the way they did in the time of Chazal. Therefore, today's mavoi is not considered a mavoi. Even if it has a chatzeros opening to it and bottom opening to the chatzeros like in Vilna, doesn't matter. You can't do lechi b'kara anyway because today's mavoi is not going to be the same as the mavoi of Chazal, even if the physical structures are the same as the way they were in the time of Chazal.